është si me prezentu Pippo Ciorra, I cili përpas një akademi profesorit, arkitektit që ka his own practice, është edhe head curator në Maxxi museum, muzeum të famshëm në Rom për arte dhe arkitekturë bashkëkohore. Mos më zgjatë më shumë se kena masani edhe një ligjëratë shumë interesante prej Jose Mateo, si kësha thirë Pippon me janis për një ligjëratë.
I know it's rather late, so I thought I would be long, dense and confused, so I will be quick, furious, fast, furious and confused. So let's see what we can do. The talk is about an exhibition. I mean, it takes its lead from an exhibition which is exhibited in the Biennale, in the Pristina event, and it's called Small Utopias. The exhibition began when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, somebody from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs asked me for a traveling exhibition who could go to cities around the world and to the Italian Institute of Cultures, universities, an event like this. They told me, Pippo, can you put together 20 architects, 20 interesting, new Italian architects to send around? And I said, no, I can't. I said, the maximum I can do is 10, because we don't have 20 new interesting architects in Italy. I think with 10 we can do a good job, which is exactly the opposite of what we do every year in the Biennale, when we have at least 100 architects put together in the pavilion, like this year also in my friend Chino's pavilion, when you have 85 architects with not even the name of the architect on the board. No? You have to look for it somewhere else. So cut down the thing, I think, to make it more clear and to really find somebody which needs to be presented to the world versus what we already know. In fact, I did not want to, my point of departure also is a sense of detachment, which was maybe also what we were talking about before in the discussion. I could not fully understand, but I can guess some of the topics. The detachment between the society and the architects, the relationship between the architects and politics and power in Italy created a very difficult condition for our 160,000 architects that are in Italy, which is, England, Britain, plus Spain, plus Germany, plus France together. So you can understand how complicated it is our life. So I didn't want to start from the senators. Renzo Piano is now a real senator. Actually, he's a live senator appointed by the President of the Republic. Renzo Piano is like a Madonna in Italy now. Whatever he touches becomes gold. This is a project by Pezzoli, an artist, and his Madonnas. I didn't want to speak about Fuchses. Fuchses became a model for a comedian in Italy, which is called Fuffas. And it expresses to the country the fact that architects only talk about bullshit, about nothing, about paillettes, if we want to say it. So this gives you also the sense of the suspicion that society has against the architects. And I didn't want to speak about Gregotti, of course, a guy who stated one day, I would never live with one of my housing projects, of course, I would say. And so we know the stories of this. These were my masters, some of them, or important architects, but we were looking for something new. There is also a problem in relationship between architecture and politics. In Italy, the guy on the left is called Larini, is an architect in Milano, and he was the first one that was arrested in 1992 because he was the one who was carrying the money for the bribery between, Maxxi, the companies, when the young Berlusconi, still with his own real hair, was starting to grow up in the country. So this figure, the public figure of the architects, has been bombed in many different ways in Italy. So there is a long and complicated work to be done. Another generation, a little younger than this, was lost In fact, because of all these complications in the relationship between architecture and society, was completely lost and dedicated themselves to drawings. No, basically we had like 15 years of only architettura disegnata in Italy. No, architects would spend all their time only in drawings, like artists, more or less. So that was, it's funny, no? Because the architecture books that were more successful in Italy are all books that speak about the lack of architecture. I wrote this book in 2011, Without Architecture, The Reason for a Crisis. The most popular book in architecture is a book by an anthropologist, an architect, Franco Lacekla, which is called Against Architecture, so you can't be clearer than that. Stefano Boeri published this book, which is The Anti-City, so you can see this kind of sense of disappointment, disenchantment, and disillusion which runs around architecture. Coming to my generation, in fact, we didn't know how to react to this condition, and we basically spent all our energy and time for 15 years studying the crisis of urbanism, no? Basically, and especially working with photographers. We all remember a very good exhibition by Boeri and Basilico in the Biennale in 1996, which was revealing this kind of clumsy incompleteness of the Italian landscape. We did another interesting experiment. It was this travel on a bus from Milano to Venezia with Olivo Barbieri, who was another incredibly good photographer that was then collected in a book by Mirko Zardini. And then we had another generation in the 90s which was very active, very lively, were very international in terms of approach to hyper-architecture, but then had no chance to build anything, so it went lost. So somehow at the beginning of the new millennium, we were in a sort of a ground zero for architecture in Italy, except for Renzo Piano, of course. And what I wanted to focus on, to depict, was what we can start to work on, starting from this ground zero. The approach was, how do I select these architects? What do I want them to be focusing about? So Italian architecture is very much about city, no? You know this. This has always been like that. And city for architects is always the idea of it's the representation of utopia. That's how we manage our idea of the city, as Rossi would say. So I wanted to understand what was happening around this concept of utopia in a moment where the city is in very, very deep crisis, and how it matches with the need of realism, with the quest for realism we are also facing to, that people ask us to face. In Italy, utopia was always a counterpart with dystopia. No? Italian architecture was never calm, quiet, crafty, well done, but it was always about very ideological contrapositions between utopia and dystopia. So after the Urbino ideal city, you will find, of course, Piranesi with this carceri, with this idea of space as a nightmare. Or Aldo Rossi, who was designing his own, let's say, progressive, in his own terms, utopia, but then building, which was based on the understanding of the context. But then Aldo Rossi's best and most important project was a very dystopic project, because it was a building that has no ground, that floats on the water in Venice and can move and go wherever it wants. Utopia was another nightmare in Rome, where all the most important architects in 1964 get together to design the whole city, basically, a whole section of the city in one project. Zevi, Quaroni, Fiorentino, all the most important architects and planners, because architects were also planners in Italy. And nothing, of course, happens when you propose such an utopia. Or we spent also years simply to show to people the dangers of architecture, the risk of architecture, tech-utopia, let's say. So Super Studio, which is again very fashionable in these days, every 10 years Super Studio becomes very fashionable. And Super Studio was very much about the death of architecture, no? Of course. Or, you know, the agri-urban experiments by Branzi, which is still going on the same. Architecture in Italy was also always very, very, very tied, very close to politics, which is a very dangerous, it's a dangerous liaison, no? It's a dangerous link which implies complications and risks. So the same day, the first 1968 riots started in the School of Architecture in Rome, in Valle Giulia. And it was more or less the same days when the artists broke into the Triennale designed by Giancarlo De Carlo and destroyed it before the opening. So this very articulate and extreme relationship between architectural utopia and politics creates, of course, lots of ruins. No? As we saw, I saw some ruins around the city today while walking around, very interesting ruins, I must say. And in Italy we have a lot of ruins of this utopistic approach. So much ruins that we have a sort of a ruin last. No? This is an exhibition that's now at the Tate Britain in London, which speaks about the attraction we have, this kind of erotic sense of attraction we feel with ruins. So we always remember Aldo Rossi with this incredibly beautiful photo by Luigi Ghirri, no? Giving the image of the cemetery in Modena. But you know, Aldo Rossi is also this building, which is still standing like that after 25 years in the outskirts of Milano, which was designed to be a station, and it's like a station. We have a lot of this. It's an interesting issue in our architecture, these signature ruins. Now, if you think of 1974, Giorgio Grassi won a competition for this student restaurant and housing in Pescara for the school, and for the university in Pescara. He won it, it was beautiful, it was Weinbrenner, it was super rationalist, but then the building is still like this, never completed, or completed and never used. After 30 years, Giuseppe Samona built a wonderful theater in Sciacca. It was published in Casabella in 1984 by Gregotti as an active building, as a completed and active building. Actually, the building never opened. It's a theater for 2,000 people in a city of 3,000 people. So you can understand how vicious, no, the relationship, this kind of strange mecenatismo, the strange patronizing relationship that politics sometimes takes with architecture, what risks brings with it. So the mayor appointed the architects only because he was a good architect and he was politically endorsed, and there was no link to what the city really needed or what the society really needed. This was my master, Quaroni, a church in Gibellini after the earthquake, which has been a ruin for 20 years with never getting to life. But the story never ends, because this is the building that Stefan Guerri built for the G8 in L'Aquila. The story is told also in the Biennale, very narcissistically by the author. And you know, the G8 in the end was moved to L'Aquila because of the earthquake, and the building, after 8 years, no? It was 2006, is already in ruin, no? It's an incredibly scary condition. So we have a ruin last on one side, but we have a utopia last on one side. No? There is a terrible and extremely irritating for me abuse of the word radical in these days. Everything is radical, every pedagogy is radical, every architecture is radical. Radical in Italy with a capital R was a very simple and clear moment in architectural research, which was, you know, the work of Super Studio, Archizum, the design of Mendini, which basically ended with that famous exhibition, which was called The New Domestic Landscape, created by Emilio Ambas. So there is an utopia nostalgia, no? We have an utopia hostalgia, we can even say here, nostalgia, and it's clearly seen in the work of very interesting Italian young groups, like the, you know, very well-known Dogma, which is starting to repropose, you know, solutions for people that have to live in 3 kilometers building, or some very fashionable groups in in Belgium, or my friends, young friends from the San Rocco magazines, they are clearly reproposing this approach, which is trying to use the vocabulary of utopia, no, versus the utopia itself. What I tried to do was exactly the opposite, so to start from very individual figure, very architects who build buildings, because we have a terrible need of good buildings in my country, because we have a terribly small percentage of good buildings. I think you can have a similar problem in many countries, including this one. So I selected 10 architects that for me were somehow exemplary of what I was trying to say. Cino Zucchi is very well known, he's from Milano, he's the curator of the Italian pavilion we just saw. Cino is some kind of here of this super professional attitude that we had in Milano for the whole 20th century. In fact, half of the Biennale, the best part of his pavilion, is dedicated to this Milano tradition of absorbing modernism. I choose a project from Cino, which is very interesting for me because it's a recycling on an existing museum. There's a new museum for the automobile, for the car in Torino, and it works around an existing massive volume and transform it by creating a new skin around it, basically. I will be very fast, I promise. A skin which, of course, works very well at night and becomes a big billboard in the city. Cino is, this is a Caccia Dominioni building. Cino is working very much with these second liners, incredibly beautiful architects that nobody has ever really known outside of Italy. This is the best project by Cino, I think, is the house in Milano, in Venezia, which was built like 10 years ago. Then an architect I'm going to see her work tomorrow, I think, Maria Giuseppina Grasso Cannizzo. There is an interesting story. Another of the parallel histories of Italian architecture is the relationship between architects and artists. After the 60s, the Triennale, the Biennale, when the Carlo, even Gregotti were working with the artists, and the artists were doing these incredibly interesting urban projects like Campo Urbano or other things. Then this thing completely vanished. It was kind of forbidden for us to speak about contemporary art. No architecture school in Italy has a program of contemporary art or a serious class of contemporary art. So maybe the architects took the art into their own work. Aldo Rossi doing his paintings, or Purini's drawings, or Scolari, Cantafora, all this generation of architects that who cut completely the relationship between architecture and art. The contemporary times where architecture is pushed so much towards this arty condition in the society. And Giuseppina is the only architect, I think, that's always had a very intense relationship with artists and also with tradition. This is her working with this old Sicilian craft people who work with doing tiles and things. This is a beautiful project she did by transforming an illegal suburban house into, taking away stuff and changing the landscape with the material she was taking away, transforming into a super sexy housing. That the project you will see in the exhibition is this project for a building in the harbor in Ragusa. The foundations were already there, the structure were already there. She worked onto it and transformed this little tower into an interesting lighthouse with 3 different programs which become 3 different parts of a building. This is a very interesting house from her. It's a house where the living room moves along with tracks and creates this loggia to the landscape. An interesting group in Torino, Elastico. The choice I did for these 10 architects to go from 90 to 25 years old. There's no generational approach, no young or old. I choose interesting people that were not known enough from whatever age. Stefano Guiatti, who's the leader of this group, is about 45. and they came out with a very simple shop in Torino, but then now they did this other recycling project at an old ski resort, which is very, very interesting, I think, and which is both very future and past, no? At the same time, and traditional in construction, but also very, very progressive. Umberto Riva, one of the most sophisticated Italian architects, I think is very, very, very charming. I think he's the guy who's bearing the tradition of all that exhibition design and interior design legacy we get from Albini, Scarpa, especially the Milanese, Albini or BBPR, and so on and so forth. This is a building, it's a shipyard that won a Medaglia d'Oro at the Triennale, but it looks very much like a table he designed, or houses in Puglia, or the exhibition design for the exhibition we did at the Maxxi on Corbusier in Italy, which was very, very well done and very successful. I included this group from Genoa, even though it's not exactly my sensibility, but because it's one of this group in Italy who's trying to work globally. No, it's not easy today to keep architecture offices alive. One of the solutions architects are doing is to open their office basically nowhere and everywhere, no? To work in the cloud, to be in Genoa, Warsaw, Africa and Dubai at the same time by developing network and relationships. They do work like that. They did that interesting installation for me when I did an exhibition called Energy, and so they installed these bikes who were producing energy, where people could both bike and go through the city or charge their own telephones. I mean, in the power that was generated by the movement. They are working with this kind of new international style, but I think it's interesting that dimensionally giving it to the studio, and it's a project in Africa, and it's kind of unusual in Italy. There's not many of these young groups that are trying to work this way. This is for me one of the best, the most interesting young group in Italy, Modus. They work in Bozen, Brixen and Bozen. The exhibition in the exhibition you will find a house they designed together with an artist in the Alps. It looks very much like the other one. I think it's interesting to find this reinterpretation of, I mean, in Frampton's time, this would be neo-regionalism. It's very interesting. I think they're developing a very good independent approach, I think, to architecture issues and to materials, to structure, to modernity and contemporary condition. This is another project they did in Brixen. It's much more, I mean, fluid and sexy, and it's not bad. I think it's an interesting group, also working very much in infrastructural areas and things like that. This is a nice story because it's a private museum built by this woman who's called Isabella Seragnoli, has a big company in Bologna, and she wanted to do a company museum, which is also a series of educational programs for the people working with her. The group who built it is from Rome. I always had a very difficult relationship with architects from Rome, even if I am from Rome, because the architects from Rome, they are intimately convinced that drawings will resolve whatever project. I mean, if your room is 180 and a bed is 2 meters, they are convinced that if they draw and redraw and they draw, in the end the bed will fit in the room. No? This is very specific in my city. But anyway, this group is very interesting. They are super contemporary, but they did a very good building. The building is establishing now a good relationship to the city. It's a private institution, and they work as much as possible to open it to the city. And they have an incredibly beautiful photography collection, which I collaborate to also. Matilde, I think it was one of the, besides, of course, the Kosovo pavilion, Matilde was one of the most interesting presents in the Biennale. She did an installation in the Corderia. It's the result of a long research she's been doing on movable religious spaces for people. So, to create your religious space independently for the urban, not urban, inside, outside condition. She did an exhibition on this at the storefront a few years ago. And in Venice, she was showing this kind of double view image which was incredibly well done, seductive, and very expressive. She's also working very much on this kind of movable space. This is a movable shop which is being designed and realized for Tel Aviv years ago. Then I come closer to my life, because these are groups, most of these last two groups are coming out of projects we've been doing in the museum. The Maxxi participates now for the 4th year to a project by MoMA which is called YAP, Young Architects Program. Every year we select a group of very young architects, and we do the same in 5 museums now around the world, in Rome, PS1 of course, Istanbul Modern, Santiago de Chile, and from this year, from next week, the Museum for Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul, Korea. And at the same time they build the 5 installations, we open the 4 of them together, because Santiago, of course, has a different climate. And START is the group that won the project the first year. They designed this kind of puzzle island in the garden of the museum, which could be put in different positions. They worked very hard, they were very serious. They collaborated with a very important lighting designers in Italy, which is Via Bizzuno. And they came out with this hill with these red poppies, which then became kind of an international hit. They are also industrially produced and sold now by Via Bizzuno, and this was a real step for the architects who were now even 30 years old when they started. And in Italy to make it now in your 30s is really, really difficult. So it was important for the museum to have this direct action, no? This is what the Americans love to say, agency, directly in the professional life of these people, and to push them somehow. I think the real confirmation of their success was when I brought the red flowers to the Shenzhen Biennale last year in Shenzhen, and in December, a bit late compared to the opening. In fact, they were not there at the opening, but they were there the next week, and 2 months ago they were already copied and reproduced in Qingdao by some Chinese group. So I think you don't have to be angry, you have to be happy, no? This is your final celebration. Another interesting group is BAM Architects, a group from Torino, extremely young. They tried to do this suspended space in the garden of the museum last year. It was very complicated technically, but it was successfully, and then this thing was floating in the air, was dripping water, was creating some shadow. It was a happy solution too, and it was a very good place for performance at night and the PS1 warm-up tradition. So but this is our story. What can be shared of this? Now, what of the work of these architects can be topics we can all say something about? We can be interesting also in Kosovo or in South America or wherever. I think the first interesting topic is this, the obsession of preservation. I think this recycle, preservation, retrofit, call it whatever you want. I think it's a very interesting condition today. I was going around today, of course, and I was fascinated by this funny ruin you have in the middle of the city, and I would love to do a recycling project with my students on this. Basically, I will probably propose them. I think what you're especially, architect building an urbanizing goes so fast, in some other areas. Think of the Far East, or even Istanbul, which is closer, or the more eastern countries. They're building so fast, so quick, that we cannot keep pace now with this new kind of market-oriented urban design approach. What we can do, I think, is to investigate and share with the world the knowledge we have about what to do with the existing. How Rome is a city which is built in layers, which have been built in layers, a piece on top of the previous piece for 2,000 years. The Roman The Renaissance monuments were built stealing pieces of the Roman ruins. So we are so used to recycle, to rebuild. And I think we have to consider recycle even more exciting than new. No? It has to be newer than the new. And so in this case, I think it could be even more interesting and funnier than the new. We did a big exhibition in the museum about the concept of recycling, and it was very successful. We exhibited in France, and we're probably bringing it in Brazil now. But also, in Colombia opened this very authorial program on preservation. My friend Pedro is much more in love with the word retrofit. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, but I think the European knowledge about what we can do with what we have in a funny economic condition like we are, in this crisis of ideas for architecture, no? After 30 years of hyper boom of formal investigations, which we cannot afford now. This is, I think, a very good topic to discuss. The next thing is this postmodernism. Now, if you go to London now, you will find projects by extremely sophisticated architects like, Caruso St. John, that looks like Portuguese in the 80s. No? This new decoration approach, the idea of historical forms, this kind of very vernacular thing are interesting. It's not my piece of cake, probably. But I think it's very interesting, and in Italy this opens, and in countries also like this, where modernism has been doing interesting things, this reinterpretation, exactly what this is what was the best part in the coolest Biennale, no? This idea of how we absorb modernity and how we can redevelop this culture into a kind of an interesting mannerism today. Another interesting topic for me is this enormous amount of architecture which is not based on building today. 20 years ago, Frank Gehry would kill to build a museum. Now Frank Gehry would kill to be in a museum. Architects now want to be exhibited, want to install, want to be treated like artists. This is good, this is bad, I don't know, we'll leave this discussion to another condition, but we are dealing in many situations with architecture which is not about building. This was kind of clumsily approached, addressed by the Betsky Biennale, which took the topic out but then did not fully develop it, but I think it's interesting. So many of the projects we've seen are based on not really construction, or a very strange way of construction. Giuseppina's house is based on something that moves around, like the shop by Matilde Cassani. The young architects build in the museum garden something which kills the old and boring discussion about the object and the representation of the object in the museum, which is not the point anymore. So I think the discussion of architecture versus art is still very interesting if we consider it critically, because it is definitely true that the situation of the urban context allows architecture very little. We do not change the world through architecture. We very rarely can do it. We very hardly can do it. So architecture becomes very similar to art, no? Because it makes comments on reality instead of changing it. But we have, of course, on one side, we have to stand on our position and still say, of course, that architecture has a different task. Architecture has to make changements where it arrives. But at the same time, we have developed tools, instruments, attitudes that are very close to the art ones. So I think it's an open discussion, but very interesting solution. Another thing which for me is crucial in this thing is that none of these architects want to belong to any tendency. Modernism was very much about teams. You were Corbusian, you were Gropiusian, you were Miesian. A successful architect was as successful as many people were trying to design like him. No? I think this is the grief of the 20th century, this is modernism. This is this kind of ambiguous similarity between politics and architecture. No? The architect wants people to follow him, just like the politician we had here just before. I don't think this is a contemporary condition. I think it's what's interesting in the work of these 10 architects, that they address this critical condition of individualism, which is today. And this is not anymore even the discussion about authoriality, that was typical in the 80s. Peter Eisenman would write a lot of pages about this, everybody would discuss this. But I don't think it's about authoriality anymore. It's about recognition. It's about that I try to do a work which is always the same, which can be easily, like a tailor. I want to be Richard Meyer. I want to be easily recognized. I don't think this is the point of architects today. I think it's much more situationist, eclectic, proteform condition, which I think is incredibly interesting. And it's also a way to challenge the condition of individualism. And in Italy, Italians were used to live in collective houses. Every Italian wanted his own house in the last 40 years. And this changed completely the landscape, and they did it without the architects, of course, and that's very important. So this individuality of this work, I think it's very interesting, and it's an interesting point for the whole situation of architecture. Then there are topics that you will not find in this exhibition, because I consciously decided this was not the time to discuss them. Of course, this is about, we are all in favor of sustainable architecture. We are all in favor of 0 mile, of whatever you want. We're all in favor of ecological sensibility and consciousness, but I don't think this can fully take the place of architecture. We do work on aesthetics, this is my position, even politics we address through aesthetics, so everything has to be sustainable, everything has to be bio, everything has to be organic, as they say in US, but this is not enough, so we cannot give away architecture to this. Another topic I'm not addressing here is this new neo-ideological approach to architecture, of this neo-autonomy needs, exactly because I think this is a legacy of the 20th century we cannot achieve today. We cannot use, but of course it's a personal position, but the form of ideology without ideology is a real scary, I think, concept. You will not find the Expo, because Expo is a boring thing, which is happening in Milano. I am forced to do an exhibition on similar topics next year in Rome, and we try to turn the concept upside down, of course. But anyway, I don't believe that Milano Expo will propose interesting architecture, and you will not find, this last generation of high-tech skyscraper, Zaha, Arata, and whatever who was here, Daniel project, and the Italian followers of this tradition, which you found actually in the last section of the first room of the Italian pavilion in Venice. So I think this can be left to other exhibition, to other discussion. But I think this is the frame. I think there are 10 interesting figures we can use to address a larger discussion in architecture. Thank you for giving this. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Pristina. Thank you all those nice volunteers you have around that are the real core of this kind of events. And thank you for being so patient, so late. And Jose, I did my best.